Good evening to everybody. Welcome to this British Nigeria Law Forum Junior Lawyers Division BNLF JLD webinar on human rights and the role of junior lawyers. This evening's presentation is about the role of junior lawyers in advancing and defending human rights. I am your host, Toks Hussain. So a little bit about me. I am the co-head of the BNLF JLD. My professional background is in international criminal justice. I'm an incoming visiting professional at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I am also an international law consultant at the Nuremberg Academy and contribute to the Oxford Public International Law module. I've worked with the UN, Global Rights Compliance, and was assistant to counsel in the China Tribunal. Finally, you can also subscribe to my legal YouTube show called Law Talks with Toks by searching my name, Toks Hussain. So that's a little bit about me, your host. Now, about the BNLF. Well, those of you who don't know too much about the British Nigeria Law Forum, well, it's a bilateral organization that serves as a communication forum between British and Nigerian lawyers for their mutual benefit and the promotion of legal ideals, although our membership is actually quite diverse and is not exclusive to Brits and Nigerians. BNLF is also recognized by the Law Society, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the Bar Standards Board, and the Nigerian Bar Association. We have quite a number of groups and divisions, including the Junior Lawyers Division. So a little bit about the BNLF Junior Lawyers Division. Well, we aim to support junior lawyers and students and solidify links between the junior section of the respective British and Nigerian legal professions. We organize seminars, events, mentoring opportunities, networking activities, etc. And of course, we are very active on social media, and I encourage you to tweet about this event using hashtag BNLF JLD. So that again is hashtag BNLF JLD and hashtag BNLF. And you can also follow at BNLF JLD, that's at BNLF JLD for legal news updates, career updates, all our events really on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And if you have any membership inquiries, please send an email with your details to jld@bnlf.org.uk. Again, that's jld@bnlf.org.uk. And you can find the details in the chat here. Now, some housekeeping for today's webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the BNLF website and also on the BNLF YouTube channel, should you wish to watch it again or share within your network. Please feel free to ask questions anytime during this webinar using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And I shall raise your questions with the speakers during the Q&A session. Now, we have a very accomplished panel of speakers for you today. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes, followed by, of course, the Q&A session. So let me introduce our panel. Firstly, we have Yumna Kamel. And who is Yumna? Good question. Yumna Kamel is the co-founder and director of Refuge, a research hub and educational platform that serves as the planet's first legal think tank dedicated to climate migrants. She is passionate about and has experience in asylum, immigration, and anti-human trafficking law. Ahead of being called to the Bar of England and Wales in November 2020, Yumna completed her LLM at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was awarded a public interest fellowship in recognition of her commitment to social justice and the rule of law. Next, we have Benson Egwuonwu. Benson Egwuonwu is a solicitor specializing in commercial litigation. He is the Africa Group Coordinator on the Law Society's International Action Team, where he researches and drafts interventions in support of lawyers subject to human rights abuses. Benson has also written articles on human rights for the award-winning digital charity called Each Other, formerly known as Rights Info. And last but not the least, of course, we have Aqsa Hussain. Aqsa Hussain is a barrister at No. 5 Chambers, specializing in criminal, public, and regulatory law. Besides her legal practice, Aqsa leads the non-profit organization Human Rights Pulse and regularly undertakes pro bono work, including providing legal advice to a hate crime charity and being a trustee at an international human rights charity. Before committing to a career at the bar, Aqsa gained experience in the fields of international development, human rights, cybersecurity, and strategy consulting. And I welcome you all, our distinguished speakers. Now, I'd like to kick this webinar off with some preliminary remarks, and I wish to address 3 points. Firstly, the current human rights landscape. Secondly, the role of junior lawyers, and finally, some words of advice. Turning first to the human rights landscape. Simply put, human rights are essentially the rights and freedoms that are attached to us because of our humanity. Now, it's a somewhat controversial topic. Human rights are often discussed in the context of a violation, and it's easy to forget to celebrate the daily freedoms that we enjoy. In recent times, we've seen the emergence and also the re-emergence of relevant human rights concerns. WikiLeaks and the Cambridge Analytica scandal alarmed us about the need to safeguard our digital and privacy rights. With the Me Too movement, we witnessed a coup on the status quo. Women empowered themselves to challenge the status quo of bullying and harassment. Of course, related to women's rights is the right to equal pay and fair wages. There's still a gender disparity. Interns are still not being paid, particularly at institutions that profess to promote human rights. On the issue of racial justice, Black Lives Matter gained traction following tragic events that shocked the world's conscience. And here in the UK, the government recently published a race report that in essence denies the existence of institutional racism. On climate change, there's a clear relationship between climate change and human rights, and you'll hear more about this from the panel. So that's the landscape. What can we actually do about it? Which brings me to my second point on the role of junior lawyers. I believe that junior lawyers are well placed to be the best advocates to tackle some of the issues that we've outlined. And in today's webinar, you're certainly going to learn about how the panel are making their contributions to human rights. I think that we can perhaps start with the issues that affect us. For example, fighting against bullying and harassment in the legal profession. That's why here at the BNLF JLD, we recently organized a training event on that issue. I believe that we can and we should work with the older advocates. For example, when I was assistant to counsel in the China Tribunal, which was led by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, and of course in related roles I've had since then, I learned a great deal about the application of the law and certainly how to develop strategies to deal with politically sensitive human rights issues. I also believe that junior lawyers have a real passion to make a difference. Allied with wisdom and strategic litigation, passion can certainly accomplish a lot of things. It's the type of passion that we saw recently in the NSAS movement in Nigeria, where the youth, including junior lawyers, took a stand against corruption and police brutality. So whether you're young in age or young in spirit, if you care about human rights, the pursuit of justice, then you can make a difference. Which brings me now to my final words of advice. When I first moved to The Hague and was working at the United Nations, I noticed a distinct feeling of idealism. So I feel certainly that to be a human rights lawyer, therefore, is to be an idealist. You believe in bridging the gap between the promise of our legal ideals and the realities of justice. And this ideal was, of course, perfectly summed up in the UN Charter. It talked about we the peoples reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and dignity and worth of the human person. So don't lose that idealism in a world of cynicism. Of course, sometimes as junior lawyers, we'll need to have more lucrative jobs because, quite frankly, we don't wish to starve. But you can still make a difference and certainly be an advocate for a human rights agenda. Next, moral courage. We have to be willing to stand up for justice, even at risk of censure. But courage must always be accompanied with wisdom and strategy. We need to pick our fights carefully and study what worked in the past. For example, previous legal cases. And we have to also judge the mood of society. Finally, never lose sight of your principles. I am personally always saddened to learn about the role judges and lawyers played in the past to provide the legal architecture of some of the worst and greatest injustices of the past. I have in mind, of course, the Nazi and apartheid regimes. And by the way, I would strongly recommend you watch this movie called Trial at Nuremberg, which in my mind perfectly encapsulate the point that I'm trying to make. But I hope that everybody here who is joining certainly knows and will do better. And that's all I have to say. I shall now give the floor to our panel. I call upon Yumna, Kamel to begin, please. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Toks, thank you for such a flattering and comprehensive introduction as to who I am, what I do, and then human rights more generally. I won't speak too much about my background because I think you've covered it quite well, but I will speak about my sort of non-linear route into human rights, how Earth Refuge came to be, and what exactly we do. So my co-founder Stephanie and I had the opportunity to start a project together in May 2020. And I went to law school because of my interest in and hope to practice at the immigration bar, and specifically within the realm of refugee law. And Steph's background has always been in environmental law. And when this opportunity arose to start a project, we found that not much had been done at the intersection between the two. This was shocking in and of itself, but what was even more shocking were the numbers. So to put it into context, the UNHCR recently released a report which confirmed that 21.5 million people flee climate factors every year. In 2019, people were 3 times more likely to be fleeing climate factors than they were war or persecution. Now, for someone who went into the law because of her interest in refugee law, I can't express how shocking this was to me. And so we decided to address the legal gap, which further exacerbates the problem. So despite these staggering numbers, and despite the fact that this issue is indiscriminate in the way in which it attacks, if you will, the global population, there are currently no active legal protections for any communities facing these disasters, not on an international level or on a local level. So that was our ultimate aim, and it remains our ultimate aim. However, as we conducted more research on the topic, we realized that though people were discussing the climate crisis and the so-called refugee crisis in lay circles or normal discourse, again, not much conversation was happening at the intersection. And when it was, in the few instances that it was being discussed, there was stigma or some misunderstanding. For instance, I don't know how many times I've used this analogy, but people often think that climate displacement is exclusive to small developing island states in the southern hemisphere that are facing rising sea levels. And that is true. But climate migration also affects families just north of Manchester that have had to flee their houses a number of times, or families fleeing wildfires in California, or existing refugees like the Rohingya people who are in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, who then have to flee their refugee settlements because of landslides. So it really is an indiscriminate tragedy. And this shaped our approach. So we are a legal think tank, but we also contextualize the problem and its solutions. And this sort of translates into our 4 projects. I will say, I didn't think my life would end up like this. I didn't think that my day-to-day would be this non-linear route. I didn't think I would start and run an organization at the age of 24. I really thought that I would do my straight law degree and practice at the bar, and that would be that. I hope that what I say or what I share can show people like me who perhaps aren't traditional lawyers, who don't come from traditional backgrounds, that the law is really and truly your power, and also it's your right to cultivate it in a creative way. And you need not, I mean, you can be a little bit scared, but you need not fear taking the road less traveled, because more often than not, it works out. So we started with 2 people behind computer screens, started this project during a pandemic, and we now have a team of just over 40 people working on all 4 of our projects. So the first of the projects is the archive. And the aim of the archive is to serve as an educational resource and to encourage dialogue in lay circles. And it also showcases the work of people who have been discussing this and researching the topic of climate migration or climate-induced displacement for many years, but haven't had a place to collectively showcase it. And it also gives students a mouthpiece. So we accept submissions from law students, activists, journalists, scientists, you name it, in multiple formats. So from more law review style papers to think pieces and even webinars. And the subject matter differs. So there's climate migration, perhaps in different locations, but there's also the drivers or the things that make it worse. For instance, environmental racism or food insecurity, indigenous rights, colonialism, corporate activity, so on and so forth. So people approach our website and aren't just met with depressing statistics. They're also met with resources and hope. We have a team of writers, and we also accept ad hoc submissions. Our second project is Faces, which is our testimonials hub, Humans of New York-esque, if you will. And the point of Faces is, well, it's in the name. We seek to put a face to the problem so that you don't just think, okay, it's happening to millions of people, but what's that got to do with me? You come to our platform and you are met with the testimonies of people who are either directly impacted or who are on the ground, so they're allies like wildfire fighters and sailors and activists, or professionals in the field. Each of these 3 groups of people are asked what they think would be the best solutions to this issue in their region. Our correspondents conduct these interviews. They span the globe, they span various backgrounds, and each one is educational and heartbreaking all at once. We then use these testimonies to help us shape and cultivate the legal solutions. So as I said, there are absolutely no legal frameworks to protect people going through this. And what we found is we don't want to dispel the Refugee Convention. It can work in certain instances, but most people who flee climate-induced displacement flee within borders. So they're internally displaced peoples. Whereas the Refugee Convention has a few hoops that one needs to jump through in order to qualify as a refugee in another country. Most obviously, you need to be outside of your country of origin or your nation of origin. And so that already slashes the chances of a huge number of people. Secondly, it's very difficult to portray climate factors as persecution, particular to a family or an individual. And so although the Refugee Convention has proven fruitful in some instances, for example, France accepted its first ever climate refugee, because of the number of people who are fleeing these things and how quickly it's happening, lawyers don't have the time to come up with arguments to squeeze people through holes that they're not meant to squeeze through. And so what we found as an organization is that going local and going regional is the best approach, because you can not only customize the solutions and the legal protections to the actual difficulties being faced by particular communities, but also you're likely to have it happen quicker. So this is sort of what we do in our legal research, or for our legal toolkits, which are our biggest project. We have a team of legal researchers who span the globe, from Zimbabwe to Hamburg to Massachusetts. We really are a large organization, and time zones are a nightmare, but a blessing. Each legal researcher is currently helping us build an internal bank of data, and this has never been done before. So what they're doing is rereading and summarizing any and all existing case law that could pertain to climate migration. So obviously no cases actually refer to climate migration by name, but there are lots of relevant factors, for instance, environmental racism, the right to a healthy environment, food insecurity, so on and so forth. They're reinterpreting these cases to see whether various communities across the globe can establish standing before various institutions or rights. The research team will then break off into different regions and develop toolkits, which will be free resources for any and all impacted communities to come visit our website and see whether or not they can even seek legal advice or have a case. And then we're also going to draft practice guides for legal professionals. So there is no lack of legal professionals or lawyers who want to represent these communities, but rather there's a lack of a cohesive body of law for them to visit. So in a nutshell, those are our three biggest projects, and our most recent project is current affairs. So when we started the project, as I said, there was absolutely nothing about this in the news, but as we progress, we're seeing quite a few news articles, but they're all quite complex. And so our current affairs team condensed this and summarize each article so that you're able to follow the headlines, and we're able to keep tabs on what's happening. That's what we do. I know I'm reaching the 10-minute mark, so I will briefly say that my advice to anyone going into human rights, especially if you're young, is honestly start with yourself. Recognize your own strengths and your weaknesses. Recognize your biases and work on them, because just because you want to go into human rights doesn't mean you don't harbor biases as a human being, and make sure that you continue doing that every day. Once you've realized what your strengths are, build a team whose strengths are your weaknesses. Even if you don't start an organization, I think there's a misconception that going into a career at the bar or in law is a very sort of lone wolf career. That's not true. It takes a village. You need a lot of people to consult, and you need them to be good at things that you're not good at. So those are my 2 cents. That's what I do, and I hope that was of some use to you.
Thank you so much, Yumna. Very inspirational words, and certainly congratulations for the good work you're doing at Refuge, and keep it up. I shall now call upon Benson to say his piece. Over to you, Benson.
Thank you, Toks, and thank you, Yumna, and thank you everyone else for attending this session. So I'm Benson, and my day job is actually being a commercial litigator. But a lot of the work that I've done in the human rights space, it's stuff that I've done pretty much on my own time outside of my job, on nights and weekends, as a kind of, voluntary endeavor. And what I'm gonna talk to you about in the brief time that we have is briefly how I got involved in, pro bono / human rights, a bit about what we do in the international action team, and a bit about finding meaning in this kind of work. So let's start with how I got involved. I can actually trace my interest in human rights issues back to secondary school. We watched a short film involving Amnesty International and political prisoners. And in that same class lesson, we wrote letters to prisoners of conscience. So that's what sensitized me first to that kind of work. But I didn't get involved in pro bono proper until I really reached law school. There were a few schemes going on. There was a housing clinic where we could advise tenants on their disputes of landlords, whether they involved service charges or various aspects of disrepair. There was also an anti-trafficking internship that was happening at the time, which I volunteered for. and it involved essentially researching human trafficking in the Philippines, gathering up lots of data on cases and information as to how the Filipino state protected victims of trafficking, how robust were the laws to prosecute and punish people who are involved in trafficking and protect the victims. So that was my first taste of essentially human rights-based projects and research. And I felt this is something I actually enjoyed doing and I wanted to do regardless of what my day job was. And so I pretty much continued in that vein. And pursuing these interests has enabled me to really try and make some kind of a contribution towards a number of different areas. One of which is the international action team with the Law Society, which I first joined in around late 2014. So what does the international action team do? It's a team that lies within the Law Society, and their remit is to advocate and defend lawyers across the world who are hindered from carrying out their professional duties as lawyers due to being subject to risk or actually having their human rights violated. So, funnily enough, this is partly the price for being a human rights advocate, particularly in other parts of the world. You have lawyers defending clients or advocating for causes or trying to hold governments to account. But what happens when those lawyers are themselves subject to human rights abuses? You need other lawyers and other aspects of civil society to advocate and shout for them. And so what the International Action Team does, and what we do, is we draft letters to state authorities, letting them know that we've become aware of certain situations pertaining to a lawyer who typically has been harassed, attacked, most cases arrested arbitrarily or detained arbitrarily, and in some cases imprisoned and even assassinated. So we write letters and interventions to state authorities, reminding them of their international obligations to protect human rights, to respect the right of lawyers to carry out their professional duties, etc., etc. And we try and persuade them and convince them to resile from their activity. So it's a way of trying to put pressure on governments. And quite often the IAT doesn't do this stuff alone. I think what Yumna said about a village is very important, because there is a whole community of organizations out there, bar associations, NGOs, which all collaborate to fight for lawyers who are at risk. One example of this work is around 2017, I was involved in providing research for a trial observation regarding some Anglophone lawyers and activists in Cameroon who were put on trial on charges of terrorism and secession before a military tribunal. And so you had a situation essentially where lawyers, because of who they were and what they did, they were being essentially having their rights violated by the state. And so I did some research. We provided a lot of research as to fair trial rights. Should civilians even be subject to the jurisdiction of a military court, etc., etc. We put all of this into a trial observation report that one of our advisors actually attended at the time, and we published it. It serves several purposes. It educates other people as to what's going on. It tries to put pressure on the government, and it reminds other people involved that there are certain standards that states are obliged to keep by when they put people on trial or when they subject people to the criminal process. We weren't the only ones involved. There were other bodies involved, the American Bar Association, Amnesty International, and this all forms part of the international effort to protect human rights, particularly those for lawyers. So that's another example of the work that we do. It's not just writing letters, it's other types of intervention. It's trial observation reports, it's drafting expert witness statements, something I did recently for a case that's currently being heard in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on judicial independence and the importance of freedom of expression for journalists and how they shouldn't be subject to arbitrary laws on penalizing speech. So that's just a flavor of the kind of stuff that we do in the IAT. Other aspects to keep in mind is because the theme of today is obviously, you know, the work of junior human rights lawyers, it's important to think about what really provides meaning to the work, and, you know, what does one get out of it, and what does one contribute to the cause. Because of the nature of the job, I think what I find interesting is that you don't always get what you want all the time. There's definitely letters that we've written that haven't resulted in somebody being released. There's definitely a sense that sometimes you can feel that as if you're banging your head against the wall, or the world isn't moving in the direction that you would ideally like it to move in. How does one find meaning in this kind of work? How does one find meaning in the late nights, in the early hours of the morning, doing research, writing, trying to organize? I think it's important to remember your why. You know, why are you doing this job? Not only on a macro level, as in, why do you want to be a human rights lawyer? Why do you want to contribute towards this defense of basic fundamental human rights? But also the why in terms of your immediate task. Why do you write this letter? Is it solely because you want to get it out of the way before you go home? Or is it because it is one piece of the puzzle that you can use in order to place that extra bit of pressure? Because someone else might read that letter and be inspired by what you've had to do. There was a letter we wrote recently to the Tanzanian government that actually influenced the UN Special Rapporteur to also draft an intervention in respect of that same lawyer who had their human rights being abused. So little things can lead to beneficial consequences. I think in remembering your why, you also have to think about self-care and community. Again, something that, you know, Yumna and Toks have alluded to. Find community in other people, I think. Liaise with them, socialize with them, network with them, you know, laugh, cry, socialize. It's important to know that one is not alone as a professional in this space. There are other people who you can combine ideas with, and it can lead to, you know, very wonderful projects and ideas. So I think that is important as well. And I think also, don't underestimate the power and potential of your skills and what you can contribute to a cause. I say this, you know, having done, you know, commercial litigation for a while now, and looking at a lot of the, quite frankly, you know, common factors and skills involved in being a lawyer point blank. Because of our training, one of our most powerful set of skills is our skills in written and oral communication. I urge people, to the extent that they haven't already done so, to, if you're serious about this, try and find a charity, a grassroots organization, lend them your skills, even if it's just a couple of hours of time a week. They may well have stuff they need to be written, whether it's a blog post, whether it's a research note, whether it's a press release, whether it's an email or a framework letter. A lot of the skills you have as professionals can easily be lent towards other causes, and there is a sense of satisfaction in that, not only for you personally, but for the person or the people or for the wider cause that you seek to contribute to. And I think that's part of the joy and part of the enjoyment of doing this kind of work, particularly as a junior lawyer. You're not too young to make that kind of difference in the world, even if it's just a local difference. So you know, please don't underestimate yourself in terms of that. And that's my comment. So looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benson. I think we joined the IAT at the same time, actually, in 2014. That's when I joined.
We did.
Yeah,
yes.
we did. So well done again for the work you are doing. And now I call upon Aqsa. Please, over to you.
Yeah, well, tough acts to follow, not going to lie, but honestly, I'll just jump off of what Benson mentioned before going into my own talk. He mentioned this idea of community and making sure that you know, reach out to people and create that community. And I can already say that I've never met Benson or Yumna in real life, but we've already had so many Zoom conversations about distinct projects that we want to work on together and things we want to do. And that's really a testament to this junior lawyer community that lots of us are trying to curate. So do get involved with that. Do get in touch with us, get in touch with others, because honestly, I think without a community, we're not going to make the waves that we hope to make in this profession. So that's what I'll say. And a lot of what I hope to say today is probably going to echo what's been said with a bit of my personal experience thrown in. And I probably want to focus on talking to you about why I wanted to do the law in the first place. About Human Rights Pulse, that Toks mentioned, is the organisation that I started. And finally, the impact that I already think junior lawyers are having in the human rights field. So firstly, with regards to why I wanted to do the law, I, similar to Yumna, did not go into the law with a very linear mindset of this is what I want to do. I know exactly what I want to do, etc. And as Toks mentioned before, I had a bit of a wander around different areas, a bit of strategy consulting here, corporate world, a bit of NGO world, etc. And then ended up in the law because I actually became disillusioned with some of the work I was doing in the international development field. And that was a field that I found that I was most passionate about, but this feeling of a lack of the rule of law, institutional corruption, bureaucracy, a lack of support for grassroots movements, etc., made me want to do something that felt a bit more practical and tangible in order to enable those projects and initiatives to really get off the ground. So with that sort of naive mindset, I stumbled into the law, did a conversion course and started my training as a barrister. I chose to specialize in crime, and I think this is important because here we've got a distinction between Benson, who went down the commercial route, which I'm not going to lie is far more sensible because you can actually get paid and enjoy doing the pro bono stuff on the side. But I took the other route, which is to go down the crime route. And let me give you the few benefits of crime, which is that, I'm in law I'm in court every single day. I'm doing advocacy, which I love. And I do feel like I'm working at the heart of justice, despite being paid absolute peanuts for it. And I think anybody who is a public defender, legal aid lawyer, etc., will constantly whine about how much you're getting paid, but it is feeling like you're doing work that is so justice oriented that keeps you going. And why I think crime is a nice segue into doing wider human rights work is because every day I feel like I am ensuring that my clients get their right to a fair trial adhered to, that I'm working with marginalized and vulnerable people every day. I'm working with clients who have issues related to human trafficking, unlawful detention, immigration issues, all sorts. And that's what makes it feel like a nice segue into getting into that more interesting strategic human rights work, which I know that many of us are itching to get into. So that's kind of why I went into the law. Now, Human Rights Pulse is an organisation I started. I urge you all to check it out because I think it's very cool. And I think my co-panellists will also attest to that. But it's an organisation I started 1.5 years ago with a team of 4 people. Today, we're a team of 40 strong with over 350 contributors from all over the world. Now, my team, exactly like Yumna said, surround yourself by a team that is where their weaknesses are your strengths and your strengths are their weaknesses. That's 100% how I have curated the team. Everybody is committed to human rights. Everyone brings different skills on board and we are all volunteers. Now, the aim of Human Rights Pulse is to create content that's accessible, engaging and practical, all related to human rights. We have, similar to Yumna's Earth Refuge, we've got current affairs articles, legal updates and community contributions, as well as lots of interesting projects on the side for young professionals to sort of engage more with the human rights field. Now, why I wanted to start Human Rights Pulse was because I felt like as a young professional, there wasn't enough space for me to write and speak about human rights. Traditionally, it felt like this field needs you to have about 100 PhDs and 1,000 years on the ground in the field before you can say anything useful about it. And I really wanted to build a space to allow young professionals to almost build their portfolio and to make it easier for them to engage with experts in the field as well. And I hope that's what we've created. And I think that is a testament to why it is doing so well and growing, because it does feel like a space to create that to create that environment for people. We are finishing our registration as a New York registered charity. If anybody wants to know why New York, you can send me a message later. It's simply administrative ease, nothing more than that. But we're excited to see where that platform goes. Now, with regards to the difference I think junior lawyers are already making in the human rights field, I'm a barrister, a very junior barrister, as many of you know. And what I can say is that from my limited experience in this profession, that it's incredible to see how diverse the profession is already becoming at the very junior end. And that's also a testament to some of the wider systemic changes that are being made across the legal profession and some of the work that that's enabling us to do. What lawyers do and say matters in society. I mean, we are respected in society far more than I thought was the case before coming into this career. And we do have an agency and a language that almost allows us to bridge that kind of gap between the very technical and the wider public arena. So that is, a strong skill set that we all bring. Some of the things that Benson mentioned, drafting, oral advocacy, etc. Those are skills that we are trained in. One of the things that I think is really cool about the junior lawyers of today is that we are daring, we're unapologetic about our values, and we are very firm in what we stand in. Again, Toks mentioned this at the beginning. I'm referencing all three of you because, you said everything I was going to say much more articulately. So, Toks said this at the beginning, never lose sight of your principles. And I think a lot of us are constantly reiterating what our principles are in the public arena and sharing our opinions on various issues. Traditionally, the barrister profession, at least, and I imagine on the whole, the legal profession, was a career where being deemed to be impartial with regards to human rights issues and even, political issues in general was seen to be the favorable position. So nothing that could compromise this idea of neutrality and that could make people think that, you wouldn't be able to represent so-and-so because you are not being deemed impartial or neutral. And I've been having lots of conversations about this with other junior lawyers to think about how to navigate this, what I consider to be a fallacy. And the reality is that people have opinions about everything. And it's about how you write those opinions in an articulate and respectful way. So, of course, we all have opinions about rights for women, children, the LGBTI community, Black and racialized groups, the disabled, marginalized, etc. Some issues, perhaps we've seen this week, the issue of Israel and Palestine, can cause far more contention in this profession than others. But ultimately, we all came into this career, into the human rights field, because we care about these things. And so I would say that if you are venturing into the human rights profession as a lawyer, to make sure that you are able to articulate those opinions in a respectful and diplomatic way. And that's probably the most important thing, as opposed to shying away from it completely. But then to kind of segue from that, my big question to you would be, as a junior lawyer, to think about how you want to approach your lawyering in general. So do you simply want to do the job, sort of stay offline, not give your opinions, which is also fine? Or do you want to almost feel as if the politics informs your lawyering? And depending on which route you want to take, we can see the way junior lawyers speak about things online, on legal Twitter, legal LinkedIn, etc. Depending on what route you want to take, it'll become very apparent to people what sorts of issues you're interested in. And, that's the reason I reached out to Yumna and Benson, because I could see there are certain issues that they are more interested in because of the way they write about them online. So sort of my final words are that as a junior lawyer, I really recommend that you get involved with lots of pro bono projects. So many have been mentioned, and they're a great way to just start engaging with the issues that you care about. There's often a rush as students or young lawyers to get into that really sexy work, the international work, basically all the stuff that Toks does, working with war criminals here and there in huge organizations. There is such a rush and a desire to do so that we forget that there are incredibly effective ways to engage with human rights as a junior at the grassroots level, where our specialized assistance could actually really help an organization. So make sure you do that. And my final words of advice would be to reach out to people who are doing the things that you're interested in, to learn from them, learn about their journeys, to start writing about the areas that you're interested in, or attending events, or even giving small talks on your, I don't know, Instagram, YouTubes, whatever. Just get your name out there as somebody who's interested. We live in an age of social media, which has almost democratized the way that we can we can earn a reputation in this field, because there's no more barriers in that sense. So use it to your advantage. And finally, echoing what Benson said really eloquently at the end, which is keep reminding yourself about why you do your work. It's so easy to become disillusioned in this field. Honestly, it really is. So just keep reminding yourself why. If you become confused why, speak to people. In fact, not too long ago, Benson and I had a chat where he was reminding me of why I was doing the work that I was doing. So, this is great. Create your community and make sure you are you're using it, and reminding yourself of why you want to do human rights work. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you so much, Aqsa. Very useful, practical advice, which I'm sure that everybody here is certainly going to benefit from. So we now open the Q&A session. So you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A tool. It's just much easier to do it that way if you can just use the tool to ask your questions. But I suppose that I could probably ask some questions to get us going. So I'll start with Yumna. You mentioned environmental racism. What does that actually mean for those of us who don't know what that means?
Okay, big question, which deserves a big answer, but I'll try and condense it. So, generally speaking, communities that have to flee climate-induced displacement across the globe are predominantly Black communities, Indigenous communities, and then women and children by proxy. Why they are more susceptible to having to move is the way society is set up, and it's systemic. So for instance, if we take the US, there are measures in urban planning called redlining. And what this does is it literally carves out sections of cities where Black people will be moved, or even Jewish communities or communities of color. But historically it was Black communities. It means that these communities are on the outskirts. They are away from anything green and any fresh food groceries. They're further away from healthcare. They're further away from adequate infrastructure and running water. This translates into failed crops, because if they try and plant anything, they haven't really got the right baseline to do so. It also translates into higher health risks, because if you live further away from somewhere where you can A, exercise, B, actually get healthy food, you are more likely to have heart problems, kidney problems, suffer from obesity, so on and so forth. Your house is less likely to be able to withstand extreme weather events. Even simple things like there are less trees, so you are more likely to be affected by extreme heat. So all of these factors affect these communities, and means that when extreme weather events hit, their communities are hit first, and often irreparably. So this is an example of environmental racism. It also manifests itself similarly with Indigenous communities when they're moved. So a lot of Indigenous communities across the globe are very tied to their land, not only in terms of appreciating it, but actually cultivating it. What to farm, how to farm it, when to farm it, the right tools, what is produced when. A lot of Indigenous communities are moved from where they're actually from. That means they don't know how to cultivate the land in the new place. It means they're stripped of their culture and their language, because of a lot of language is tied directly to the land and the work that's carried out through it and those livelihoods. Those are just two examples of environmental racism. There's plenty more, especially when it comes to slums and migrant communities. But those templates can basically be picked up and looked at across the globe. All these situations mirror each other in different places.
Thank you very much, Yumna. That's a very helpful explanation. And I think certainly not many people appreciate how important land is, certainly in terms of wealth accumulation. So it does certainly make a difference to these communities. Benson, I want to ask you a question. Why do you think that lawyers are often the targets of these human rights abuses? So that's the first question. And secondly, have you noticed any difference in COVID-19? Has there been more of these crackdowns on lawyers and journalists, or is it about the same in your mind?
Thanks, Toks. So in terms of your first question, I think because lawyers naturally are going to be the people who are, I mean, you have to have a certain level of education, you have to have a certain level of, I guess, particularly political consciousness in order to defend people and represent people who have human rights grievances against the state. Because lawyers have, I think Aqsa mentioned, this kind of respectability and status. They can make for very formidable and powerful opponents to a state that is hostile to the idea of human rights. And so we've seen this in history where lawyers have, essentially been marginalized or ignored or attacked, and we see it today as well. And there's another issue here, which is in societies where the power differential is a lot more pronounced, where there's a lot more authoritarian tendencies coming from the state. Often you might find that it's actually the bar association itself that is the primary line of defense of basic and fundamental rights. And so in that context, it isn't so surprising when, lawyers are, attacked and, oppressed and detained and arrested and harassed in particular. In terms of trends, I mean, off the top of my head, a lot of what the IAT has done, I mean, there's a lot of activity in Turkey for obvious reasons right now. There's a lot of problems with lawyers essentially being harassed and attacked. Some have even been killed in Turkey. There's similar issues in China. There's similar issues in Iran. And again, the politics of those places is such that people who are lawyers, and to be honest, broadening it out to what we call human rights defenders. So people who may not necessarily be legally qualified, but who are still powerful advocates of fundamental rights, whether you are an activist or a journalist or even writers. Because again, writers communicate ideas. They open up worlds where they'll, worlds and windows to what is really going on in a society. And so I think that's why those people tend to be more susceptible to being attacked. In terms of COVID-19 trends, I don't have a particular view on that. What I would surmise is, given the issue with restrictions and given the fact that people aren't as active as they were, I mean, naturally, lawyers are going to have something to say about that. And I think when society opens up again, and the kind of society that we'd like to see, when things open up again, I think it'll be interesting to see how our legal architecture responds to that, or how our legal architecture is affected by that. So I can't make a particular comment on that, but I think in any event, we do have to be aware of what our laws are doing, because obviously we've undergone significant restrictions, and there are definitely other lawyers and legal commentators out there who have had some pretty strong opinions on that.
Thanks very much, Benson. Let's have a question. We have a question for Aqsa. I want to ask you, in relation to your point you made in your presentation, it was about the debate you have, and people certainly have a view when it comes to crime. Some people would say, "Oh, I would never defend somebody. I'll only prosecute, etc." But then they forget about this concept called the presumption of innocence. Could you just explain what exactly is this presumption of innocence business we were talking about?
Yeah, such a good question. I think every single criminal defense barrister, lawyer, attorney, whatever gets asked, how do you defend somebody who's guilty? How do you defend someone who murdered someone or raped someone or, you know, did something bad? And the reality is we remind ourselves that we are there to do a job, right? And our job is to make sure that this person, no matter how heinous the crimes that they've been alleged to have committed are, they deserve a fair trial. And the job is for us to make sure we put the prosecution to proof. It's the prosecution's job always to prove beyond a reasonable doubt or to the standard of sure, whatever country that you're in, but it is always to that very high standard that they did what they did. The reality is any of us sitting here today could be, I don't know, done for dangerous driving. I mean, sometimes the way I drive, I do think that that could be a crime. I could be in the Crown Court for, or, you know, anything really. You know, you accidentally hit someone too hard because in self-defense, but you fracture their skull. The number of times little things like that happen, accidents or mistakes become, you know, land you in the criminal justice system. You'd want to make sure you get that fair trial, no matter how heinous the allegation against you is. So yeah, how do we do it? We do it. And at least in the UK, having a wig and a gown, I know that's such an outdated tradition that many of us question, but it does create this separation between me and my clients. It makes me, you know, quite, I don't know, like feel like I'm putting on a uniform. I mean, it is a cape, to be honest. So I do feel like Superwoman sometimes, but it does allow you to create this level of an emotional barrier if there are some issues that do really affect you. I know people who have children, so have real difficulties dealing with child sex cases, or people who have been victims of sexual assault themselves, now having to defend somebody, you know, being tried for sexual violence. It is difficult. There's no doubt about it. That's why you have a community of lawyers that you also rely on. And that's why you do have lots of kind of safeguards in place to help you navigate those more personal issues. But ultimately, my job is to make sure my client has a fair trial, despite whatever crime he commits, or she commits, or they commit.
Thank you. Much needed explanation. So here's a question we're going to ask everybody, and it's about how do you gain experience in, you know, pro bono work, etc., or maybe in the bar, shadowing barristers, or gaining experience in a charity. What steps could one actually follow? Perhaps we'll start with Yumna.
Absolutely. In all honesty, I started at university. I joined I went to Queen Mary and I joined the Legal Advice Center. And I also joined a few other, there were sort of charities on campus. And so you were allowed to contribute to amicus briefs, or I think also the Citizens Advice Bureau is a really good starting place for a lot of people. And then I also contributed to, I mean, if you look at different universities and their law groups, you don't always have to attend university to work with, you know, whatever opportunities they present. So I also volunteered at One Day Seyum, an organization dedicated to the Eritrean human rights movement and freedom of speech and the ending of the regime. And they also happen to have stuff there, you know, for refugee rights and refugees in Libya. So, but it was started by Vanessa, who went to SOAS. But, you know, if you look at university groups on LinkedIn, there will always be something for you to do, and you don't need to dedicate a huge amount of time because there are so many other students doing it too. So just keep your eyes peeled.
Benson?
Thanks. I think to an extent, it depends on what stage you're at now. As Yumna said, if you're at university, then definitely look for any opportunities you can find at university. If you're at law school, I mean, law school should typically have a whole host of pro bono opportunities, and there it's just a case of, you know, signing up and putting your name forward. Or if you get rejected the first time, try again the second time. I mentioned doing a trafficking internship when I was at BPP. I didn't get taken on the first time. I racked up a bit more experience through the housing clinic and then applied again, and I got taken on. So do that if you're at law school. If you're already in the professional space, even if you're already practicing or training, then in fact, look at opportunities that your firm or your chambers or whatever organization that you're working at has in terms of pro bono legal work and the broader corporate social responsibility work. There's many law firms out there now, particularly in the city, which do a large proportion of, law center work, or they'll collaborate on a kind of research project with various other clearinghouses, pro bono organizations that divvy up voluntary work to different firms. So get involved in that. And again, I think apart from the rest of it, just write to said charity or write to said organization, send them an email, tell them who you are, what your qualifications are, what your interests are, and try and get on write to them, try and get in contact with them and see what their needs are and see how you can assist and see how it goes from there.
Very sensible advice. I'd say that probably half the experience that I've gotten was just through that initiative, just approaching people. Do you need any assistance? And then, you'll be surprised the doors that could open. So don't always wait to see the vacancies page and the charity's website. Just feel free, as Benson said, to approach and say what you can offer. Aqsa, what say you?
Yeah, what say I once everything's been said, I guess? Well, I would say that if they're to kind of add from what they said, but not to repeat it, if the opportunities aren't out there, create them yourselves. That's what I did with Human Rights Pulse, right? That's what Yumna did with Earth Refuge. There was no such infrastructure there for these projects, so we just created it. Now that is there, come join us, don't create something. We don't like working in silos in the human rights community, but create something. If your university or your chambers or your law firm isn't hosting events about particular issues that you think it should be engaging with more, get together with a group of lawyers or students, whatever stage you're at, and ask whether those events could be hosted. Take initiative. I think it's so important, especially in this profession where there is no linear path. And most people in 20 years' time, I think all of us in 20 years, when we do a panel discussion and have a little reunion with this panel, will say, oh gosh, nothing turned out the way I thought it would when I was in my early 20s or 30s. It's just, don't expect there to be a linear path, and do just keep taking that initiative.
Awesome, thank you. So we've got a question which I suspect is directed towards Aqsa, but feel free to have other people can contribute as well. So the question is, does it make the prosecutor's job harder to prove guilt when they're trying to provide justice to victims who at times are not even present to provide the side of the story? But before you answer that, Aqsa, let me just say that certainly in the field of international criminal justice, there's now a greater move towards ensuring that victims are actually active. So, for example, you may have counsel that is actually assigned for victims, and so you could actually have victims as well participate in the process directly, or another format is called People's Tribunals. So if you feel, for example, that a particular cause isn't taken seriously by the international community or local courts, then a group of people can come together with the legal community, civil society, and create what's called People's Tribunals. And that way, it aims to be quite victim-centered. So that's just to provide a bit of context on the international level at least. But on the local level, Aqsa, does it make the prosecutor's job harder if the victims aren't involved?
Yeah, sometimes it does. I mean, when you have victims telling you, look, this happened, I'm telling you this happened, and I prosecute and defend. That is one of the cool things about the bar in England, that we really are seen as independent advocates, so we can receive briefs from either the Crown Prosecution Service or from defence solicitors. it does make it harder, especially when you feel this heavy pressure to do the victims justice if you are prosecuting. But your case is only as good as your evidence, always. So even if you have a gut feeling that, gosh, this person really did it, but unfortunately I just don't have that proof, well, ultimately you're an officer of the court. That's what you are, and it's your duty to not make things up, fabricate things. Not that I'm saying that happens, but don't embellish a victim's story to try to put your case across. You really only work with what you have, and sometimes it does mean that somebody you thought was guilty walks away. But there is also the saying, I always mention it, but I actually don't know who said it, better that an innocent man goes better a guilty man goes free than an innocent man goes to prison. And that is the crux of our justice system. If you are not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, you should not get put away. And it is the Crown's job, it's the police's job, it's everybody on that side of the system's job to make sure that they have concrete evidence to put somebody away. Otherwise it just shouldn't happen. So sure, victims are disappointed sometimes, but that is the inherent risk of this system.
Thank you. I actually want to get Benson's view in relation to the work being done at IAT. So I personally don't like the term victims, but what I mean, of course, are people who are actually affected by these human rights abuses. Is there a way to gauge how effective the efforts are being made, certainly from the Law Society or in the national community? Because I imagine sometimes these things might be quite closed doors. So is there a way to gauge success?
Yeah, thanks, Toks. It can be difficult. I mean, you're really working with a number of metrics. For example, if somebody's imprisoned, then if they've been released, then that's obviously a good outcome. If they're not released, then that's obviously not so ideal. But if further attention has been brought to their cause, that can be seen as something positive. I mean, harking back to 2017, the trial observation report that we prepared in respect of Felix Agbo-Bala and the other Anglophone activists. I mean, again, there was many other groups. The Bar Human Rights Committee, I believe, did a trial observation report, as well as I think the American Bar Association and other groups. And eventually, I think later in the year, said people actually got released. So that was a good outcome. But the metrics do vary. And, as I alluded to before, sometimes you may not get the response that you want. You may not have the grand situation where the person emerges from prison. And so it's a case of really trying to measure, success or progress from several levels. Is there a release? Is there more attention being brought to this cause? Have you been able to escalate the issue to the UN or any other regional human rights body that can take it up? Is difficult. But in terms of, victims / participating people who are participating in that process, again, I think it's important on the topic of participation to remember that, again, the issue is not just about bursting into another country's affairs and lecturing and finger wagging at the state authority. That can actually have a very counterproductive effect. And what the Law Society does is always liaise with the Bar Association or other groups on the ground to see if they actually want the Law Society to say something publicly. There are definitely instances where we've made initial inquiries and actually decided that we don't really need to do anything because the Bar Association they've got it covered, and so they don't require our assistance. And so it really speaks to really respecting the work of other organizations who actually have a lot more intimate knowledge of the area of the issue than we may do back in the UK. And it also points to what Aqsa said about the profession not working in silos. There has to be a kind of collaboration, because otherwise you're not going to get the best outcome for the person whose rights are being violated. So it's something to be very conscious of.
Thanks, Benson. I think also the fact that most of these defending, communities, I'll put it that way, what's useful is that the constitutions also have provisions that protect these said rights. So it's not as if you're proposing anything out of the ordinary by skirting these international standards that have to be upheld. It's also most times, isn't it, the fact that the constitutions might protect the right to free speech or any other type of right as well. Isn't that the case, Benson?
Yeah, I agreed. There's definitely fundamental rights in the Constitution, and there's lawyers who have a better idea of how to use and deploy those laws than a lawyer from overseas. So again, those kind of laws, they actually have a lot more appeal to the state authority than referring to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. You have to kind of pick your language and figure out what actually works best. Is it legal language? If so, does referring to the Universal Declaration work, or actually does referring to the National Constitution work, or does referring to law work altogether? There's something that I believe Professor Marko Milanovic said, which is sometimes law just gets in the way. Sometimes it's actually far more effective to make a political or moral appeal to a country rather than a legal appeal. So it depends on the situation, but yes, of course, national legal instruments can also get the job done, but that's why you have to always collaborate with people on the ground.
Awesome. This is a question for Yumna, and I think we'll start to round up. Okay, so for Yumna, I think I'm just going to read it. I think she mentioned that there was a lack of legal architecture concerning the juncture between refugee law and environmental/climate law. How can you bring actors to account for their actions? Do you need to create the architecture and framework first before you can do this? Or are there mechanisms available right now? Thanks.
Okay, good question. I think a lot of what I'll say, I'll try and keep it very brief, but a lot of what I'll say will circle back to what Benson's just been saying about being cautious about finger wagging, not because accountability doesn't mean something. And on a personal level, accountability means a lot, but on an institution to institution level, one has to err on the side of caution, I think, because it's easier to get productive things done when you cooperate, as opposed to pointing the finger at another organization and saying, you did this, I'm accusing you, now you've got to fix it. That said, because we take a local or regional approach, we are keen to and will be or are on track to communicating with local authorities or regional authorities as opposed to national governments. And the reason for this is that there's often a lot less red tape, but also because the problems and solutions are very particular to that region or that community. And local authorities are often better versed in what is happening in the intricacies and in roping in various actors, for instance, members of those actual communities, civil servants, lawyers, engineers, so on and so forth. I think in some instances there will have to be frameworks that are developed before anything can be done. But I think for the most part, establishing certain rights in certain jurisdictions or in localities is enough to at least start to have these conversations and make sure we mitigate these crises. For instance, implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and allowing certain communities to go into sustainable agriculture so that they can adapt when crises hit and they don't need to move. These are conversations that can be had with local authorities. So there's a lot in case law. It can be fun. Legal research can be fun. I would have never thought this in my third year of law school, but there you have it. And you don't always need a framework. You just need to shift your perspective on policy, existing policy and existing precedents.
Thank you so much, Yumna, and thank you to everybody who has asked questions and certainly participated in this very insightful webinar. I thank you all for attending. Once again, I'd like to thank the panelists for very insightful conversation, and certainly do follow the work that they are doing. You'll see in the chat that we previously posted on the respective organizations, so be sure to follow. If you want to volunteer, certainly make applications going forward. Do tweet about this event using hashtag BNLF and hashtag BNLF JLD. if you enjoyed it, go ahead, recommend the program. Again, I'll say that it's going to be uploaded to YouTube in due course. Our next event is going to be in June. It's called the Path to Law. Basically, we're going to talk about how to get into practice. There's been a lot of changes, certainly in qualifying in the UK, also alternatives to law, etc. So highly recommend. I know there've been some questions about, you know, pupillage, etc. So I would highly recommend you attend the next event. That's more focused on careers, etc. What else is there to say? Well, if you want to join, be a member of the BNLF, certainly send an email to info@bnlf.org.uk, and you'll see throughout the chat, there's certainly been information about how to become a member. So that is it. Once again, thank you all for your valuable time and the contributions, and I wish you a very good evening. Once again, Toks the same, and I look forward to seeing you at the very next BNLF JLD event. Do have a great evening, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.